Hello and welcome to the Point Blank Show. My name is Abhishek. Our guest today is John Dykes, the man who brought clarity and wit to sports broadcasting in India, among many other countries. I'm part of the generation that watched him do his thing on the small screen. He had this knack of not just relaying what was happening on the field, but also, he would answer questions just as about they were forming in some of our heads. He would also nudge his fellow commentators to add their perspective. Throughout his career, John interviewed everyone from Arnold Schwarzenegger to Thierry Henry. First in his stint as a newspaper reporter or a features writer, and then as a television presenter. And none of those machine-like responses when John would interview his guests. No. He got them to open up. And that's saying a lot, given that more often than not, these celebrities are guarded, and for good reason. I would imagine that the sports gene ran deep. He was born and raised in Essex, and he would often go to Chelmsford to watch Graham Goochpad, that same bugger who hammered India 333 runs back in 1990. And some of us on the podcast may be old enough to remember that. When John was 4 or 5 years old, his dad told him to chuck his toys for a bit and come join him to watch the 1970 World Cup, which Brazil went on to win. And that team had Pele in its attack. And it's hardly surprising then that John ended up playing all sports imaginable growing up. And later, as we all know, he went on to anchor and cover cricket, golf, rugby, tennis, MotoGP, Formula One, and more recently, the Oyster Opening Championship, if I get that right, in Singapore. And today, after all these years, John is digging into his rich experience of over 3 decades to help organizations and individuals to get better at telling compelling stories, making killer pitches, how to build a high-performing team, storytelling. You've got crisis management, because he had his fair share behind the screens as well, and a lot more. John, it means a lot that you've agreed to do this, and thanks a lot for joining in.
Oh, well, Abhishek, that's fantastic. What an intro that was. I'm actually going to be digging into oysters again tomorrow, because it's that time of the year again. But you've gone deep in your research there, almost hot ones deep, and I appreciate that. So, thanks very much. It's great to be chatting.
Oh, thanks, John. The pleasure is all mine. And I have to tell you that there are a lot of butterflies in my stomach as I speak with you. I want to ask you this. Did you ever, despite being the pro that you are, first of all, did you have any butterflies when the camera would zoom in? And I know that you're not a fan of teleprompters, and this is the first time I have tried to introduce someone without reading it off the monitor. And I know it can be tough, and you did it for a living.
Yeah, butterfly. Let's start with the butterflies. Yeah, I think butterflies are always good. If you perform as an athlete, if you perform in any field, it's good to be nervous, because that nervous energy produces the endorphins, which increases your performance levels. So it's always good to have a little bit of nerves. But in terms of specific to speaking on air, I always spoke a lot. Probably spoke too much, and I probably still do speak too much. My friends and family will tell you. But in a professional sense, I was somebody who purveyed a written word rather than a spoken word for a long time. But naturally, I sort of moved towards the camera, and people nudged me towards the camera. So when I first started doing it, there were probably some nerves, more to do not so much with how I was going to speak and what I was going to say, but how you would structure it and the actual technicalities of speaking in a TV context. But beyond that, yes, you do have moments. There's always, if you're about to go on air, as I did with the Premier League TV channel, and you're going out to an audience that's in the millions, I'm guessing, in terms of the amount of people we covered across the world, and you've got an 8 or 9 hour shift lying in front of you, and you've got 3 live matches in a row, plus a roundup of all the other games, plus some high quality pundits alongside you in that studio. Yeah, you have some nerves. And, one of the things we can talk about today is how you make those nerves work for you, but also how you allay those nerves with your preparation, with your confidence, with all of the little tricks that, as you said, I'm now beginning to bring to another field, in terms of, rather than specifically just going in front of cameras and speaking on TV, actually empowering other people in getting the best out of their speaking situations.
Right. And tell me, growing up, for us, I texted a friend of mine after 15 years, all right, the other day that I'm going to be talking to John Dykes. Do you remember who he is? I hadn't spoken to him in 15 years. And his response was, he's the one who introduced sports broadcasting to us in India. Now, I remember you, Alan Wilkins, Harsha Bogle, you may not have played Test cricket, but that's what set you apart. Now, who taught you all of these things? Did you learn on the job? Did you have a playbook? How did you go about your gig over the years and the early days, John?
That's a good question, and I'll try and keep the answer brief. But the short answer is no one really taught me. So what I did was I absorbed it. When I was growing up, and you're absolutely right in your introduction, I loved sport. Sport was my thing. So I went to a boarding school, and from the age of 10, even though I was still in England, my father traveled a lot as a banker, and logistically it was just easier for me to be in a boarding school. And if there's one thing that an English boarding school does, it teaches you to either love sport or hate it. And fortunately I was very active and very sporty as a youngster. And I found sport was a great escape for me, because we got a bit lonely and a bit scary at school sometimes. But if there was sport to throw yourself into, I loved it. And it just so happened that, I was pretty good at cross country running, and I could play rugby and cricket and football, and I was on the gymnastics team. So there was always some sport for me. So sport was always around. And because of my interest in it, I had a natural leaning towards sports coverage. So I would scour and devour the papers cover to cover. I knew every cricket score. I went through all the tiny little fine print results. I knew if Graham Gooch had indeed scored yet another century, or Keith Fletcher, or whoever it was in Essex in those days was doing well. So I guess what was happening was I was absorbing this. And one interesting thing that happened, it was by this stage I would have been about maybe 12 years old, and it was a Wednesday afternoon. We always used to have games on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and you'd have everyone playing whatever time of year. It might be cricket, rugby, football. And I remember once I'd played a game, and then I was wandering back across the fields, and my housemaster came over and he said, John, do you know, incidentally, what happened in the game between that house and that house? Oh, and I told him, and what about that one? And without him saying anything, he said, I knew I could count on you for this. He basically had sort of nudged me towards what I ended up doing. And I didn't realize it at the time. I never, if someone said to me, what are you going to be? I never said I'm going to be a sports journalist or reporter, but I think it just happened. And then I moved to Hong Kong when I was 17. And when I was in Hong Kong, we didn't have a whole lot of coverage of football. We'd get like a once a week, 1 hour English football show. Even pre-Premier League, it would be sort of, you'd get highlights of one match, and that would be about it. But what we did get, we'd get live radio coverage, either by the British Forces or BBC, whatever we could get. And I would just lie there in bed on a Saturday night, and sometimes a Sunday, just with listening to the radio. And again, you're subconsciously just absorbing all of these journalistic skills, this reportage, this passion for sport, the vernacular. So I guess it was all in me. And when the time finally came for me to actually find a path in life, which was to move into newspapers initially and then move into TV, it was there, and it came out naturally.
But when that move came into TV, you didn't embrace it at the first go, did you? You said,
no,
this is not for me, is what I read.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely true. So I was I was a product of the 70s in England, really, and culturally, I'm still into. If I was to tilt my camera, you'd see a heavy metal bar poster behind me, and if you looked over there, you'd see all of my music collection and what have you. So I'm a product of a sort of a punky, rebellious era, but also I was a journalist, a print journalist. And back in those days, if you were a print journalist and you were British, and you tended to be a little bit cynical, I'm going to say, to be honest with you, and you didn't always go along with things that you considered to be, cheesy or crass or what have you. So the first approach to do TV came when I was actually working as a kind of a film critic on a newspaper and a magazine, as well as an entertainment writer. And, when you do that, you kind of feel fiercely independent in terms of it's my opinion, it's an unbiased opinion. And a TV company came to me and said, look, we really should get you on the show because, we read your stuff, it's good, and we think you'd be good on camera. And I was, a bit like, oh, that's corny. You mean I have to look at a camera and I have to actually sort of, speak on camera. So, I was stupid and resistant, but fortunately they were a nice bunch of people, and they said, well, we'll ease you into it. And then within weeks, I was basically a fixture on the show. And then it took me into anchoring, which was great. So I reported, then I learned how to anchor shows, and I co-presented a show. And then I worked on live coverage of the Oscars, for a few years in a row. So that was my way in there.
Yeah, and you talked a little bit about preparation, and I remember there was a show called was Inside Cricket. It used to air
Yeah, that's right.
twice a week, and you would end up pretty much writing, hosting, producing, and presenting the whole thing. Now, how
Yeah.
important is do you think your ability to write? How important is that craft to the whole thing? Because
Yeah.
talking is one thing, but writing is a manifestation of thinking, is what some people say. And to be able to do that consistently, how important is writing to the whole thing?
It's hugely important, yeah. I mean, to give you a little bit of background, I was always crazy about cricket. I played it up there, not very good. I just wasn't really. I was somebody who wanted to try and be a quick bowler, but I wasn't built for it. You know, I'm 5'10", and just not what have you. But when I played in England, we played on grass wickets, so I managed to get into the school first team. I was at a place called Brentwood, which was where Frank Lampard, the footballer, went, and a couple of other ex-footballers and people. And we used to have a game every year against the county. Essex would come and play, but we were on a grass track, and I was somebody because literally I was at boarding school. Every day after school, I'd go in the nets and I would just bowl and bowl and bowl and bowl. So I got into a groove, and I was, able to consistently, reproduce an action. So the pitchers would help me, and I would be put on to bowl, maybe first change, and I could bowl 25 overs and take, 2 for 35 or something like that. Just nice and tight, nothing too crazy, and that's what I did. But then I moved to Hong Kong, where you're playing on plastic tracks. Basically, batsmen just hit through the line, and it was goodbye. And I wasn't netting, I wasn't practicing. I took up all the bad habits that you do in your early 20s. And so cricket became something that I played at the weekends because it was what we did, and I got worse and worse at it. And eventually it was like, why am I doing this? This is pretty pointless. But I still loved it, and I loved all the sort of village crickety style things around it. So cricket was in my blood, and cricket was very much something I was passionate about. So when I got the chance to work at Star Sports, where initially I did football commentary, as you said, F1 and all sorts of stuff, one of the producers came to me and said, we'd like to make a weekly cricket show, maybe twice a week, but we don't really have any experts in the building in terms of on-air talent. So I said, I'll do it. So I basically sat down with them, and I came up with the content, I scripted it, they went away and cut the packages and edited, and then I went in front of the camera and I produced it. And one thing that's undoubtedly true is it's always easier to read your own words. If you've scripted something, then when it comes to it, you really can deliver it well, because you know exactly what you mean to say and how you mean to say it. And to your point earlier on about auto cues, I have nothing against auto cues. And in a certain context, like reading the news or somewhere where the facts have to be absolutely spot on, you need it. What I learned to do, though, is I learned to work without an auto cue, even on a live 8-hour Premier League broadcast, by having worked on the script for a day or two. So it's in there, it's in my language, and then rehearsal. Rehearsal is the key to everything. And I use a phrase when I train people, it's earn the right to play. And what I mean by that, it's a football expression saying you have to do the hard work first before you can then get the tricks out. And what I would do is I would rehearse really, really ferociously, to the point that I then knew all the content, which meant that when we went live, I can then riff around what we've got. I could embroider it with different phrases or expressions, or I could back refer to something one of the guests has just said, or I could come off a live shot and just tweak what it was I was going to say, which gives you a spontaneity and an in-the-moment freshness that means your delivery is better. And purely in technical terms, Abhishek, the other thing as well is your eye line isn't just moving across a script. And you will see that when you see somebody reading an auto cue. No matter how much technology might try and disguise that, I just like the fact that when you deliver a line like this organically, you do it better.
And
So that was it. Cricket, by the way, just to go back to that, cricket was a joy for me. And I very soon was able to go into live cricket presenting. I did the '99 World Cup on site in England. I was in India to cover Australian tours. I was covering Ashes tours. I was in Sharjah covering ODIs. So I absolutely loved it. And along the way, we launched a show called Cricket Up Close, in which I would sit down one-on-one with cricketers and do interviews as well. So off the top of my head, I think I interviewed probably the War brothers on one trip to India, Darren Lehman, I think, Nasser Hussain, Darren Goff. Yeah. I mean, it's you would get whoever you could in the world of cricket and sit and interview them. And of course, because we were covering Indian cricket all the time, I was there a lot. So I was lucky enough to watch my first test match at the Chinnaswamy in Bangalore and just marvel at the whole experience. And that stayed with me ever since.
And there's something about interviewing, John. There are two kinds of people. So I work in an IT function at an air conditioning firm in the day job, and I have to go and look at panel discussions sometimes as an audience member. Oftentimes, the interviewer, the moderator, will never butt in, add his perspective, will never, if there is some panelist droning on for a long time, with due respect to the CIO or CXO that may be, the moderator's role is far more than that. But I guess people often get it wrong, which never used to happen with you or Bogle's of the world or Wilkinses of the world in the commentary box, and you're dealing with Jeffrey Boycotts or Tendulkars on the other side, where you have a responsibility for the audience as well, not just to the guys sitting there. Right. How did you balance that bit? Because that's a tough one when you have big names there.
Okay, well, I can't speak for the other guys because everyone comes to this role slightly differently in terms of their background. But my pathway was that I was a reporter and then I became an interviewer. Now, I was never really a hard-nosed news reporter. I always gravitated more towards the writing side of things. So I would write a diary column or I wrote features. And I particularly discovered that I loved doing interviews for long form magazine or newspaper features, researching, going out, sitting down with someone. And I interviewed people from all walks of life. When I was at the newspaper, from heart surgeon Christian Barnard to novelist John le Carre, to the wife of the governor of Hong Kong, to British politicians, to showbiz stars ranging from Jackie Chan to Schwarzenegger to Oliver Stone, the conspiracy theory director. I covered all sorts of things, and that teaches you the skill of interviewing, and it teaches you something which I'm going to come back to a lot in this conversation, I think, Abhishek, which is empathy. You have to make yourself relatable to the subject. You have to be engaging. You have to show them that you know your stuff, which means that they respect you, and then the conversation will be better. But in terms of panel discussion, whether it's on TV or on stage, the key to a great panel discussion is actually listening. And ask yourself this, those guys that you spoke about, those situations in panels, and we've all been there at conferences or elsewhere, how often do you notice that the host, very often on TV, and we're a pretty vain bunch, us TV presenters, we can be fairly narcissistic, and certain people, I feel, have a habit of asking a question, delivering it the most beautifully articulate way they can, so they look great, they sound great, and then shutting off, not listening to the answer. And you'll notice this happen, because what will happen is the presenter will ask the question, or the moderator, and then they'll immediately start thinking about their next one. Right, how am I going to do the next one? How am I going to make myself look good? And the interviewee might actually give them an absolute stunning answer. They might give them the proverbial juicy half volley, sitting up there waiting to be smashed, and they miss it. And the audience goes, huh? I'm surprised that he or she didn't come back on that. And instead they just go ahead with their next question. So the key to it is empathy. Very often the second question is way more important than the first, because my belief has always been that when you have a discussion of any kind, or a situation, whether it's on screen or on stage, you have to turn it into a one-of-the-kind, only in that moment, organic event. And that means that you're empowering and you're entertaining the audience and you're bringing the audience with you on this journey. Oh, that person said this, so I'm going to use a part of that answer in my segue into the next question to the next panelist, or I'm even going to follow up in a way that we hadn't originally planned because you've just said something that's so provocative or compelling. So in so doing, it means that you move away from a scripted chat. And as always happens with these things, you tend to have a pre-conference meeting and you plan things out, and that's great. A bit like my rehearsed spontaneity I spoke about earlier on. You need the structure, but that structure then empowers you to elevate things to this organic, only in that moment level. And that, for me, is the holy grail. That's what we're aiming for. We're aiming for that experience. And I think you half quoted something that I've spoken about in the past, and I'm just going to detail that for you now. The line about answering a question just as it's forming in the viewer's mind. That was given to me by the doyen of cricket presenters and commentators, Richie Benner. And I was very privileged as a very young man. I was at a test match at Lord's and he was commentating for BBC or someone. And my producer introduced me to him. And what a remarkable man. He knew who I was, which was very flattering. he complimented me on something he must have seen me do, maybe in India, or I don't know. And he said to me, I'll tell you what, I haven't got a lot of time here, but I'll just give you one piece of advice. And he gave me that line. He said that, as far as I'm concerned, the secret to great commentary is answering a question just as it's beginning to form in the viewer's mind. And if you break that down, Abhishek, what it does is it absolutely sums up everything I always try to do. It means that we're using our expertise and our knowledge as pundits or whoever we may be, whilst something is happening, to have an understanding of that, which we then apply by identifying a trend or something and then articulating it in such a way that it empowers the viewer. Because if the viewer is just starting to subconsciously notice something and we address it and then we explain it, right, the viewers then go, yeah, you see, I saw that. Yeah, that's what's happening. I knew that was going on. So what you've done is you've actually empowered the viewer. You've educated to an extent, but not by talking down at them, not by being patronizing in any way whatsoever. And you've turned it into this united, organic teamwork in which you are enjoying this experience together and you're going places with it. So that, I think if I had to use an analogy to sum up everything I try and do in my career, that's it.
And that the part about enjoying and being one with the experience, I've watched one of your recent interviews. I think it was September 2023. You were in a very intimate setting. It wasn't on TV, but it was more like a fireside chat with Alex and Maila Shibutani, who are the medalists, the Olympic medalists and ice dancing champions.
That's right.
I think
the Shibsibs. They're known as the Shibsibs. Those two.
Yeah. Is that so? Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And you started with a little. You said that let me break some ice, and that was a bit of a dad joke, is what you confessed. And then you went on to introduce both of them simultaneously, instead of saying this is what Alex has done and this is what Maila has done. Yeah. And so much so that the experience bit, I think Alex went on to then thank you and say that we would like to thank John, who's been with us in every step of the journey, or that he's very well prepared because that was a killer introduction. And then you were just smiling there and you just say, we do what we do. And then you put the spotlight back on the siblings. But this needs, so two things. One is this needs preparation. It can't be, you can't wing it, right? Because help me out here. How does that work? Because it's a moment that looks very natural, and you've won your audience there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the key to it is if you're going to be interviewing somebody, you pretty much have to make sure that they don't have to like you, but it helps. But if they can respect you, that's the start point for this. And how do you establish that? Well, either in the preparatory work leading up to the interview, either sometime out or immediately before it, you try and make some conversation in such a way that you show them that you respect them, that you know about them, that you're not taking them into an uncomfortable position where you're going to ask dumb questions that make them feel uncomfortable. And then once you get into the interview itself, you also do what you can to set them at ease. So that business about not introducing them separately, I always try to avoid the clunky formulaic, which is why I spoke earlier on about the second question being more important than the first. I'm a big believer in not going through that formulaic sort of, this person has done this and this and this and this, and here they are. And then this person has done this and this and this, and here they are. Now I'm going to ask this person a question and then that person a question. No, keep it flowing, keep it natural. All the stuff we want will come out, and it will come out in a far more natural way than if we just force it. So that's one thing I really believe in. To the point about, when you've interviewed as many people as I have, if you've got a notoriously testy interview subject opposite you, it could be, I interviewed some Hollywood action stars, and among those action stars, Schwarzenegger, Stallone, Van Damme, I interviewed Steven Seagal, who everything you've heard is true. Very difficult person to interview. Yeah. And, you when you're confronted by someone like that, you've got to try and do something to sort of try and make them, open up and be friendly and chatty with you. I'll give you an example of how it worked to my advantage once. One of the best interviews I've ever done was with Thierry. And at the time, it would have been the early 2000s, around the time Arsenal were invincible. And you know, he was playing as well as anyone in Europe at that time. He honestly, he was just unstoppable. He'd get the ball, he'd cut in from the left, he'd bend the ball into the far post. And he did it with a swagger and insouciance and arrogance, just incredible. And we would go to clubs around England and do interviews for a series called Football Up Close, which followed Cricket Up Close. And it would be a half-hour interview format, sit down for a long time. Sometimes, you know, if we could get them up to 20, 25 minutes. But very often the clubs were like, no, you can only have 10 minutes. But we'd have to then try and stretch that out into a 24.5-minute format with advertising breaks. But anyway, we got to Arsenal, and I'd already done an interview with Dennis Bergkamp, who'd been really good. And then we went back for Thierry, and I thought, he is the hottest property in football right now. He strikes me as being somebody who's so glamorous that he's not going to want to do this for very long. Arsenal were rushing things along on the day, and we just had a bad feeling about it. So we eventually set up in the room. We had the cameras set up, all good to go. And they bring Thierry in, and here he comes in, and his charisma is immediately obvious. So we sat down, and as you know, with interviews, what happens is everyone gets set up, you start putting the microphones on and feeding them up your shirt and making sure everyone's comfortable. And during that period, that's the time that I always like to do a little bit of ice breaking. And we had a slight technical hiccup with one thing, so I knew it was going to take another couple of minutes. So I just sort of made a bit of small talk with Thierry. He'd become a father recently to a daughter, and I have two daughters. And I said to him something along the lines of, hey, congratulations on having a daughter. There's just nothing better. I've got two myself, two little ones, and you know, they're the most magical thing that's ever happened to me. And his eyes just lit up, and you could just see, you know, it meant a lot to him. And so having done that, you know, we established a bit of a rapport, and then we started the interview. And it was a sort of a life and times. So, you know, you're dragging someone all the way through from childhood to more recent stories. When I spoke to him about his childhood, it was fascinating because he talked about growing up in the suburbs of Paris. And he then went into a sort of not a rant, but he went into quite a serious talk about racial tension and religious tension and how he felt in a few years' time there were going to be serious problems in France because of this, because of inner city problems and tensions that were rising. And as he was doing this, I caught my producer's eye. He was standing in the background. He was raising an eyebrow as if to say, wow, did not see this coming. And then we went on a little bit further with the interview, and Thierry was talking about his father and the influence he had. And it was, from what I could make out, it was a slightly strained relationship. And then he sort of went, he said, John, father-son relationships are really complex. And then he started giving me this lovely insight. So, I wasn't just getting, this is how I scored that goal, or this was what I did when I, transferred from that club to this club. We were getting this great interview. And honestly, it came down to the fact that I'd established trust and a rapport at the beginning of the interview. And that's something that, we should always seek to do.
And that's the empathy bit that you talked a few minutes ago.
Empathy is everything, absolutely everything.
And it's like, is it also, when it comes to rehearsing and preparation, they say that actors, when they know their lines really well, it liberates them to improvise. Is that totally pretty much is what that is then? And you've been going to Toastmasters group to help yourself get even better, which is quite humbling. What kind of work do you do there? How do you practice? And what kind of, I just dropped my mic. What kind of... what kind
it's
of
too early
for a
too early for a mic drop moment, I think, Abhishek, to be honest with you. But what I do is that thing you mentioned is absolutely true. I call it rehearsed spontaneity. So it's this thing about knowing your content so well that you can take liberties with it. You can, in the moment, you can improvise. You can just flex a little bit with it. You can adjust the tone to impact to reflect the environment and the context of what's happening. So I would say, the big buzzwords I use these days, empathy is a huge one. I think context and nuance are others. And we live in an age when context and nuance are getting left behind quite a lot, but I still feel it's very important. The speaking thing is interesting to me in that, obviously I've spoken on screen for many, many years. One of the side products of being a TV presenter is you do find yourself on stage, emceeing events, comparing things, doing fireside chats, hosting award shows. So that was something that I grew into naturally. But that's a whole world removed from standing in front of a room and telling a story. And that requires, as I've discovered, that requires training, and that requires you having mentors, and that requires practice. So I have a kind of a portfolio career at the moment in that I don't work for any one big broadcaster as I used to, which I did all my career, working for a big broadcaster or the Premier League or someone like that, covering either all the sports they did or one sport or whatever it might be. So I work in a freelance context. I do some commentary. I do a little bit of presenting every now and then, and that's on a sort of an ad hoc basis with different sports. But I'm also doing a lot more hosting. So I'll be on stage, comparing an event. Say David Beckham comes to Singapore and does an event at the big resort here. Then I'll go on stage with him and I'll be the presenter and I'll interview David and do something like that. Or when the Formula One comes here, I did some work recently, the last Formula One with the Ferrari team. So again, get them in front of you, interview them at a sort of a corporate gathering or something like that. Or putting on some little workshops and fireside chats. When Liverpool toured Singapore two summers in a row, 3-4 years ago, I was working with their sponsor and they got me to do some fireside chats in a corporate environment whereby we would bring Jurgen Klopp, the manager, and Billy Hogan, the CEO of the club. And we would sit there with maybe 30 C-suite leaders or even government ministers and deliver a presentation and a chat around things like winning mentality or leadership strategy or team building. And this has naturally seen me sort of segue into that space. So I do a lot. I work in that environment. I work sometimes directly with companies, going into the companies and speaking to them about speech and presentation and pitching and learning how to tell stories. But the interesting one is the keynote space. And this is where the storytelling comes in. So that's where I'm having to not start from scratch, but I'm having to sort of learn how to take what I've got and turn it into something compelling. So I did a story the other day, a talk it was a kind of a Toastmasters event. It was a TEDx kind of talk, a 10-minute thing. And I took something that happened to me recently and I turned it into a learning. And that's something that I really enjoy doing because I'm now taking things I've seen and heard from elite level sport in particular. Yeah. And I'm saying, well, how can I now transfer that into something relatable, but also useful for a variety of audiences? So it might be doing something about the way that David Beckham constantly adjusted his brand throughout his career to go beyond being just a footballer and to become something else that has been truly sustainable for him now that he's really just known as an icon rather than a footballer. Or it might be how an interview with a very young Serena Williams showed me that she has a real growth mindset and a willingness to learn. And it came from a very small incident, a very small episode. So things like that, I find I really enjoy crafting into relatable talks that then allow the audience to say, well, how can I apply that to myself?
No, and that helps a great deal. That Serena Williams, I think you talk about it in one of your podcasts that she used a word in an interview while talking to you. Is that help me out here? And the reason why I ask you this is it helps us as individuals who have nothing to do with elite sports to know, oh, okay, even these guys have a human side.
I think that's the beauty of it. I mean, we speak about empathy and we're always looking for empathy. Sometimes these sports stars can appear completely on a pedestal. They seem totally remote from us, but in their own way, they're not really that much different from us. They have their insecurities and they have their fears and, they have the needs that we all have. And with the Serena one, for example, I used to cover a little bit of tennis occasionally. Alan Wilkins took over from me when I started doing football full time, but I used to work with VJ Armitage, of course, and did a couple of Wimbledons and US Opens. But I would also occasionally go and interview players. And someone told me, there's a big tennis tournament in Hong Kong. Would you go and interview some of the stars? So Steffi Graf was there, Anna Kournikova was there, and they said these two young up-and-coming players, the Williams sisters, are going to be there. So I went along and I had a hotel session set up with all of the players. Steffi Graf was very charming, very media trained, didn't give anything away, just a slick professional interview. Kournikova, similarly, she was a very glamorous sort of person at that time. And so she gave an interview that didn't really give much away, but was, charismatic. But when the two girls came in, they actually had a coach with them at the time. And the coach had actually spent some time in Beijing and he spoke some Mandarin. But we were in Hong Kong where they speak Cantonese. So just as we were setting up for the interview, they were chatting away, in the background about speaking Chinese. And, I happen to speak a little bit of Cantonese. So I sort of popped a couple of words in their direction and said, yeah, but over here they say it like that. And so that was quite cute as an icebreaker, in terms of, oh, right, this is really interesting. And then the coach came and had a chat. Once we got the interview going, they were really cool, but we did them one by one. And when I was doing the Serena interview, not long into it, she was giving me an answer, and she used a word, and I can't actually remember what the word was, but it was a long word, but she used it appropriately, and it was in context. And before I could say anything else, she said, "Now, did that word work? Was that appropriate? Was that the right one?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" I said, "Yeah, it was fine. I understood your answer." And she said, "Yeah, you see, I'm trying to pick up a new word every day. And I'm trying to, implement this whenever possible. And I'm trying to expand my vocabulary and make it work." And what was great about that was what I took from it was, firstly, she'd made an effort to make our interview better, and she'd actually spoken with me rather than just giving me a robotic answer. And she'd sort of tried to enhance the engagement. But secondly, it demonstrated that she did have this growth mindset, this willingness to learn. And, when you see that in a sports person, you think, oh, this person could go far. And it's easy with the benefit of hindsight, to look back and go, there you go. 23 Grand Slam singles titles because she was learning a word every day. It's not as simple as that, but those things, in terms of my speaking portfolio, they can build out into something, and then you can bring other examples in of those who have talent. And at elite level sport, just about everyone has talent. Everyone has talent, and there's only a tiny percentage that differentiates any of those elite level sports people, but it's the mentality that separates them. And it might be the ability to work hard. It might be the ability to be humble. It might be the ability, as in her case, to absorb and to learn and grow. And later on in her career, you saw that she made a transformation. She was this serial winner of titles, and I think built up not animosity, but I think there was a bit of resistance to her. They saw her as being this, physically impressive, imposing, sort of juggernaut of a champion. And then I think in the postpartum, there was a situation when her child came along, when she suddenly transformed into somebody who was a spokesperson, and an advocate for women and for mothers. And that was interesting. And I think, again, you could see that she had the potential within her to understand how she should move into that space. So I found it quite interesting, yeah.
Yeah, and these big names, what we see as viewers, John, in fact, you get a sense of them in flesh when you talk to them. But for us, what we see is only the glamour and for example, Shah Rukh Khan, he's the biggest star in India ever produced, perhaps, whether you like him or not. And he took over from Amitabh Bachchan, who's another big superstar. When it came, there is a series called Kaun Banega Crorepati, which is Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, the Hindi version. Now,
yeah, I remember it. Yeah,
you remember? Yeah. So what impressed me was, there is this line, right? It takes 20 years to become an overnight success. Some stand-up comedian said that.
Yeah.
And
right.
and Shah Rukh Khan had got the entire first floor of his house. I think he rigged it to look like the set of that Kaun Banega Crorepati, that event. And he got his friends to sit on the hot seat, and he would rehearse with a few months to
there you go.
And one of his friends, I looked it up on Times of India. He said that apart from the fog machine, there was everything there. So the amount of preparation that goes in, I think you talk about Gary Neville. He did something similar before he actually went on the crease. No, not on the crease. Sorry, that's a cricketing metaphor. On in front of the camera. So there's a lot of work that goes in, which is very heartening to know that this doesn't come automatically.
No, I'll tell you the Gary Neville story. Actually, he was a very good cricketer as well, Gary Neville. He could have certainly played to a county level, I think. But no, the thing about Gary was that it was an interesting one. Gary was, as a player, he wasn't always liked by everybody because he was this busy, bustling player who always got involved in everything. And even some of his teammates found him a little bit too full on and intense. But when I went to interview him at Manchester United's training ground once, we'd done an interview, I think, with Ruud van Nistelrooy earlier on that day, and we were all set up in the interview room. And the PR woman came in and she said, "Look, we're really sorry, Gary's just had a bit of a bang in the face during training this morning. And he's got to go to hospital for a precautionary x-ray on his nose.
Right.
We can't do the interview." can we reschedule? And we said, well, we can't really. We're flying back to Asia tomorrow, so it's today or never. And she said, I'm afraid that's a problem because he's got to go to the doctors. So we were sort of, wearily sort of packing up, and we were really upset because, we'd gone a long way to try and get this interview. And suddenly, she popped her head back in and said, oh, funnily enough, I just had a call from Gary. And Gary said, he'll do the interview. He knows that you've come a long way for this. Go down to his apartment downtown, get yourself set up. His partner will let you in, make yourselves comfortable. And as soon as I'm done at the hospital, I'll come along, which was great. So, I was very disposed towards thinking, this is quite impressive. But what I heard was when he was retiring from football, but to be, he was immediately approached to go onto the Sky's Monday Night Football, which was the one where they used to have the very detailed touchscreen, the flat one, and very complicated. And as somebody who, when touchscreens first came in, I had to learn how to work on it, and I would stand there on the Premier League channel, live at 5-ish on a Saturday afternoon when all of the action was coming in. And I would have to, without having seen it, I would have to, look at clips, pause things, draw arrows on them, bring my guest in, call up a league table, change the stats, update data and stuff like that. Very scary, and quite a...
And your producer, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you also say that while you were talking, you got used to your producers talking in your earpiece as well. So that also...
Well, that's another thing you have to get used to, and so there's a lot going on. So anyway, it's very scary for as a presenter, you do get used to it because it's what you do and you just practice. For pundits, especially someone who's spent their whole life playing football, not being a journalist, it's a bit tricky dealing with something like that. And the tech always had the potential to go wrong. So, if you move the thing the wrong way, it might turn into a box instead of an arrow, or it might wipe everything. So, it's pretty scary doing it live. But anyway, what I heard was that once Gary signed the contract, he just said, there's one thing I absolutely insist on. It's the summertime now. The season doesn't start till August sometime. I want you to send that touchscreen to my house. And I want it to be loaded with material, and I want to be able to practice on it. And he did. And he trained all summer long on working on the touchscreen so that when they first went live in, the end of the first week of August, second week of August, whenever it was the season started, he was 100% ready to do it live. And that's, that's what sets people apart. And look at his career. He's gone on to have a great career in TV.
Yeah, he keeps fighting with Jamie Carragher though all the time, but it's one of those.
But that's a product of modern media. Yeah, but that's a product of modern media, and that's something I don't necessarily like. But that's just the way the world is. Everything has to be polarized, doesn't it, for engagement?
Because these things go viral these days. But tell me one thing: for all the preparation that you put in, you will always have a moment like you did on January 25th, 2021. If you remember that evening when your alumnus, I don't know, Frank Lampard was sacked by Chelsea, you had to pretty much rip your prepared show apart and put something up. Take me into the studio. What happened at 7:15 in the evening, and how did you go about the whole thing? Because you just got the news and you're all prepared yourself for some other show altogether.
Yeah, well, I mean, what you do at times like that, and this comes back to the very essence, as far as I'm concerned, of broadcasting and any live event, is at the heart of everything is communication. And whenever you do a live show, there are so many moving parts to it. You're just the face. You're the person that's actually on screen delivering it. But you have got the team that has been working for days, building content, graphics, packages, all sorts of stuff. You've got the team that's actually the technical crew that is working the lights, the cameras, the sound. You've got people working on the graphics elements that are going live into the show or that have been pre-produced. You've got people working on the transmission. You've got a director. You've got a producer. And everyone has to have the same vision, i.e. you've sat down, you've been through what the show is going to be about, you've rehearsed it, ideally, and then you go live, as it may be, and you deliver according to whatever the vision is. But then you're right. Then something comes along and completely sideswipes you, and you've got to change. So what you do then is you trust in each other's knowledge and each other's ability. And with just moments to go before the show starts, you go, okay, this has happened. How quickly can we access some generic footage of Frank Lampard managing or playing? How quickly can we put some graphics together reviewing his career? How quickly could we maybe grab a couple of tweets or something that we can then put onto a graphic? Okay, so you have that conversation, and then the producer saying, look, we're going to work on all that, but we're on air now, so you're going to have to just carry this for now. So what I'll do at the start is I'll make an announcement, and then I'll get an immediate reaction from the guest who's with me. Then I'll come back. By this stage, the producer might be in my ear saying, all right, I can't put the graphic up yet, but what I can tell you is that there's a statement from Chelsea which says da-da-da-da-da. So you repeat that verbatim as it comes in. So the key to this one is, and I've always said this is one of the more esoteric skills for a TV presenter. Some can do it, some can't. I found that for some reason, maybe I'm schizophrenic or something, I have an ability to compartmentalize, in which even as I'm sitting here talking to you and thinking about my delivery and my gestures and what have you, there'll be a part of my brain that's thinking, okay, look, how far through the interview are we right now? What have we addressed? Is there anything else that we need to be perhaps thinking about here? And maybe at the same time, I could have someone talking to me and I'll be processing that conversation. So what I've found is that is a really important skill in live television. And I'll give you an example of that. When you work in TV, you have an earpiece in, okay? And that goes to a gallery. And in the gallery, you have a director or a producer, and they have a key, which they key on to speak to you, and then they switch it off typically. Very often what I would do is, because you have a lot of moving parts in a TV show, in the old days, it used to be coming from video, but then it would become an EVS, an electronic video editing system that the clips would come from, or you'd have graphics coming in, or you'd have music coming in, something, or live pictures coming in, all from different sources in the gallery. What I like to do is when I was live, I like to leave the key open so that even if the producer or the director weren't speaking to me, and even though I could hear background noise going on, people talking to each other in the gallery, it didn't faze me. Because what I found was that if I heard the video operator saying to the director, you're going to have to hold on because there's a problem with this file, it's corrupted, or we've got to fix the intro a little bit, that buys me an extra couple of seconds and at the time, I'm probably listening to an answer from a guest or I'm asking a question. It buys me a couple of extra seconds to actually just stretch things out a little bit. So before the director's had a chance to come back and say, keep talking because we need to paddle a little bit here, I've already got it. So that ability to hear whilst you're speaking, to process, to then put it into a context and editorialize, that helps you in the live context. And, you know, I'm kind of blessed, I think, in a way that I never found that to be too much of a problem.
I think it also goes down to practice. You must have by then the fabled 10,000 hours. You would have done all of that in your from the day you started your newspaper journalism career, and the work ethic. Roy Keane keeps talking about putting in the shift. Same thing is what you've done over the years. And there's an article in Hong Kong People on May 16, 2010. I don't know if you remember this. This was eons ago, and it says you arrived in Hong Kong at midnight. On a Tuesday, you were back to Singapore on a 3 p.m. flight the next day and straight to London to prepare for the FA Cup's coverage. When I looked up the date, it was, I think, Chelsea versus Portsmouth back in the day. And do you remember what you told Matthew Scott, the article's author, when he told you that, hey, you've worked so hard? Do you remember what you said? You said, I'm a lucky guy, and I'm quoting you, I'm doing what I love doing. Has that been a constant blessing throughout your life? Or not everybody gets to do what they love, but they need not love what they do. They can find passion in the work that they have. That's a different story. Yeah. But is that something that you hold very dear, that you've always enjoyed what you've done?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I never knew what I wanted to do. And it's funny, when you interview a lot of people in my line of work, they often say, I knew from a young age I wanted to be a TV presenter, or I knew I wanted to do this. I had no idea. Therefore, my story about not wanting to be on TV or anything like that, no idea. What I've tended to find in my life is that I have found there are things I can do. And thanks to some really kind people and some really generous people who've steered me, who've seen things in me and then steered me into positions whereby they hire me, or they say, look, don't be stupid, go and do the TV. Or at one point in my life, someone said to me, look, do you want to be a producer or a presenter? And I was umming and ahhing about it. And my boss at the time came, put his hand over the mouthpiece of the phone, looked at me and said, you're a presenter, you idiot. telling me you're a presenter. So, oh yeah, I present more than I produce, and that's how I became the Star Sports presenter.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you just need people this guy afterwards said to me, "Are you mad? How many people get a chance to be offered a job as a presenter?" Oh well,
Yeah.
so you need that. But I found that I've always had people who put me into areas that I can work.
Mm.
So I won't lie and say it was always my passion to do football or my passion to do this. I could do it. And I found that as long as people said, oh, he can do it and he can do it well and we'll pay him to do it, I would go and do it. Sport has always been everything for me. So it's always going to be underneath. But I don't have to work in sport just for the sake of being in
Mm.
sport. If there's no work for me at the moment in sport, I'm really happy to watch sport and I'll go and work in the corporate space or I'll go and do something else.
Yeah.
So that's the difference. I would dearly love to be maybe still sitting on top of a broadcast, doing something. But it's where I am right now. I've had big long contracts with ESPN, with the Premier League. I'm in Singapore right now, where we don't actually have any regional broadcasters. So I'm not doing like a big regional broadcast job at the moment. So because I choose to be here, it means I have this sort of portfolio career.
Yeah.
But I still do what I do. But the key to it is the work ethic. And I got that from learning to work in Hong Kong. My first jobs came in Hong Kong, which is a very hard working place. And when I worked in magazines and in newspapers, you would put in all the hours it took to get the
Mm.
work done. And when you grow up with that kind of discipline and that ethic, that stays with you. So for me, the non-negotiable has always been, I will do whatever it takes to get it done. So if I'm on a commentary assignment in China doing world table tennis, which I do quite often, WTT, I might, head to the stadium at 9 or 10 in the morning. I might not get finished till 10 or 11 at night, go back home, do my prep, make sure that I'm 100% ready for the next day, and then get up and do it again. That I would never complain about that. If I
Mm.
felt that's what it takes to get it done, then that's what I'll do. Because you're privileged to work in
Yeah.
those kind of roles, and you should never take it for granted.
And did some of that come from your dad as well? He also, he was a banker, and he set something up for the first time at the time, which was apparently quite pioneering, which is loan syndication. What are a couple of lessons that he taught you, apart from hopefully his love for bikes that may have rubbed off, if at all it did, on you?
Yeah. Dan was from a very working class background from Newcastle, and he started working in banks without any real education. But because he was so clever and so hardworking, the opportunities came along, and he transitioned from somebody who had moved south to London from Newcastle as a teenager to somebody who found himself in Hong Kong as the managing director of a Citicorp subsidiary, in which they basically put together vast loans for infrastructure projects around the world, hundreds of millions of dollars or whatever it was, and that career transformation was just extraordinary in terms of how he did it. And I saw how he did it. He did it by traveling the world, by working hard, by just putting in the effort. And so that stays with you. But what he also did was he was somebody who would not suffer fools, but he would always make a point of trying to engage and work with as many people as possible who he felt could help and benefit the product and whatever he was doing. So he taught me a lot about being open-minded, about exploring different cultures. He took us all to Hong Kong as a family. We traveled the world as a family. He would try anything to eat, to drink. He had a very inquiring, open mind, and that always came to me. But what he always said to me, and I'm unfortunate, I didn't inherit any of his financial ability whatsoever, and any of his sort of economic nous and stuff like that. But he did say to me at quite a young age, he said, you've got the ability to speak. And he said, that's going to be so important for you. If nothing else, be able to present your ideas, be able to speak, and be able to get your message across. And, I think in a way that's kind of guided me through my career.
Yeah, and this ability to speak is one thing, and also to add humor. Just a few minutes ago, when I dropped my mic accidentally, you said it's too early for a mic drop moment. Now that comes in the moment. And I don't know, is it with Brits or the ones who have, that kind of a background? Because everyone, Nasser Hussain, David Gower, Ian Botham, Bumble, that's David Lloyd. Atherton, they all seem to have this self-deprecating humor about them, never too loud. They'll pull each other's legs, and it's quite witty. Is that England or what? How can you learn these things?
I think there's two things to that. Firstly, yes, there is a British sense of humor, and it is
Yeah.
self-deprecating, and we try not to take things too seriously, and crucially, we try not to take ourselves too seriously. Now, when you work in in the TV business, you'll find that there's an awful lot of people who take themselves incredibly seriously. So yes, we do differentiate ourselves, I guess, as Brits or people of British origin who try and just downplay things a little bit. But to the mic drop, for example, I spoke earlier on about the second question being most important, or the segue. Things like that are vital, because that means that, you've knocked your mic over. I've made a joke about it. And it means that we've got a once only occasion where just for that moment, that was maybe the right thing to say, like one of my dad jokes or what have you. But it just humanizes a situation. But it also means that, that was the podcast where I knocked over my mic. So anyone who's listening or watching will go, oh, right, yeah, okay. Yeah, that was good.
Yeah, and Brian Robson, there is one place where you talk about what happened there. Tell us.
Brian Robson. I'll tell you two things about Brian Robson. One thing, going back to what you said about finding some common ground with very famous people. Sorry, I've got some drilling noise in the background, but
yeah.
Brian was part of a Manchester United team, and I don't think it's any secret that used to like to have a beer, when they had a night off or something like that, and he could hold his own with this crew. And what I found really interesting about Brian was one of my heroes as a footballer, because I was lousy as a footballer, but I was quite a good athlete, so I could always run up and down. And what I liked about him was that he had the ability to win a tackle, charge up the field, and score a goal, and just do it time and time and time again, and I just loved that energy. So I always loved Brian as a footballer, and I was really privileged to get to know him quite well. And we would put some long hours in on air sometimes, working together at ESPN. And I remember I could sit there and I'd be trying to ask him questions when I first was working with him about who was the hardest midfielder you played against, or tell me about that. And actually, you could see him glazing over. It wasn't that interesting. But as soon as I mentioned something along the lines of, I went out and had a couple of beers with my mates, he'd go, oh, yeah? What'd you do? Where did you go? How was it? And what have you?
Yeah.
And he just enjoyed that. He enjoyed what he considered to be normal people things, like, guys going out and having fun together, or if I told him stuff about the family. And so what you do is you find a rapport with someone. You find what works for them. And I've seen that with a lot of athletes. Yeah. Ryan Giggs once told me that he felt very uncomfortable, always being put behind a velvet rope and always being treated as this superstar. And all he wanted to do was just sit at the bar with guys and have a chat. Yeah. So anyway, you hear that. But the one about Brian that I think you're thinking of is Brian came up with one of my favorite lines. We were live on air, going out to so many people around Asia. It was when we were doing ESPN, and he had a phone in his pocket and it went off, and it was during a halftime analysis, and we were live, and these things happen, but this was quite a loud ringtone, and he slapped away in his pocket and turned it off eventually. But we weren't actually in vision at the time. We were talking over some clips of a goal or analyzing it or something like that, and he managed to turn the phone off, and we went to a commercial break. And in the break, I said to him, Brian, look, I'm really sorry, but I said, you may be, Captain Marvel, you may be Captain of England, you may be, one of United's legends, but, in this studio, if a phone goes off, there's a fine. It's a jug of beer. And he goes, oh, no problem with that. And I said to him, by the way, incidentally, what would you have done? This is what I really need to know. Imagine if we hadn't been out of vision talking over a goal.
Yeah.
Imagine if the camera was on you when your phone went off loudly, and vibrates in your pocket and everything like that. What would you do? And he turned around and he said, oh, that's easy, John. I'd have taken the phone out of my pocket and I'd have gone, not now, Fergie, I'm busy. Which,
yes.
I thought, that I almost wish that had happened.
Yes, and again, goes back to, I think, the British sense of humor, I guess. Now, English is something that comes very naturally to you. English literature is what you've studied. From, I can't even pronounce this right because I haven't read any of his works, Dostoevsky to Dickens. You've covered the whole gamut. So obviously all of that helps. So does it ever happen where you get into a tiff with your producer when he wants you to say something, or you've got a certain way of doing it, but the English doesn't sound right? Are you fastidious about these things? Give me an example if that happens at all.
My kids will tell you yes. They'll say, "Oh, Dad, you're such a grammar Nazi," or "Oh, you're so fussy about stuff like that." But I try not to be too pedantic about it, but I do worry a little bit about slipping standards. And just this week, I'm sitting here honestly thinking about writing a post about some of the common mistakes that have just been allowed to creep into common usage because people haven't been bothered to correct them. And I'll give you an example of it. I keep hearing people say, it's been too long since I stepped foot in there rather than set foot. And it's now become a thing. So, whether it's come into common usage or
No,
what have you,
say
I
that
keep hearing
again.
people say,
Sorry, I didn't get that.
people
So
say,
it's been too long. Yeah, sorry.
yeah, people say, I step foot somewhere rather than I set foot in somewhere.
Yeah.
So that one's crept in. So I find myself sort of wincing a little bit, going, well, it's actually set foot. It's not step. I can see why you say it, but it's not right. But the one that really gets me, and this will resonate amongst an Indian audience, I am absolutely fed up with the way that finals, as in the World Cup cricket finals, has been allowed to replace final, which is completely correct, because a one-off match is a final. It is a singular, definitive match. The World Cup finals refers to that tournament that happens, say, in soccer, where you have all the teams playing in Germany for 1 month, and eventually they make their way to one final where two teams play against each other. And throughout my career, I've seen this coming in. And it came from tennis, because in America, they confuse things, because you have like the finals of a World Series, or in certain sports, you have the finals, more than one match to determine who's going to be the winner of something. That's the final series, right? And again, people are sitting there going, "Oh my God, what's he on about?" But things like this sort of, that mean a lot to me, because, it's just clarity and correct usage of language. And when people sort of say, "Oh, it doesn't matter that much, it's just, it's just English, we know what it means," I always sort of say, "Yeah, but would you apply that to coding? Would you say, well, coding was kind of right?" I think there are little things that I really insist upon. I worked with a guy once. I love it when people get it wrong, and it's not through any fault of their own. I worked with a footballer who he hadn't studied literature at university, and he always used to talk to me about Jekyll and Hyde rather than Jekyll and Hyde. And he didn't know any better, and I just loved it every time he said Jekyll and Hyde. And you don't mock or belittle anyone for it, but it always gave me just like a little chuckle. And I'm sure there are things that I get wrong as well. But no, I like the written word. In fact, I love the written word and the spoken word. And when it's done right, I think it's a thing of beauty.
Yeah. Have you ever had an Indian write an email to you ending with "I will do the needful"? This is one of my favorite Indian phrases, where they just say, "I'll do the needful." You don't have to worry about. I've used this a couple of times with my guests in the podcast, and they've always been fascinated.
Do the needful. And the other one that got me, the other got me was revert. Suddenly people started talking about, "I will revert back." What? Revert? You mean you'll go back to your previous state? You know what I mean? And it's very here in Singapore, which is funny, because Singapore has its own, Singlish, which is Singapore English, what have you. People take English and they do weird things. Very often when they say they're going to go shopping at the supermarket, they'll say, "I'm going to do some marketing."
I didn't know that. That's new.
which and actually some of these things I absolutely love. But it's just that's why language is wonderful.
Absolutely, and you must have been a little bit of a pain in the backside of some of your producers, if not too much. And talking about pain, and before I let you go, John, I am absolutely impressed by a couple of your LinkedIn posts where you recently turned 60, and you've written, you beat everybody at your gym when it came to these what are they, really high intensity workouts, which include rowing, bench press, and whatnot. Tell us about turning 60, and also talk us about your old lefty, which hasn't left your body for a long time.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, thank you for that. I mean, let's not get too carried away here. I've always been massively into training and fitness. I probably lost my way in my mid-years when I got a little bit too heavy and probably, drank too much and ate too much. And as a result of that, I was playing football, which is something I wish I hadn't done after the age of about 30. And I blew out my left knee, ACL reconstruction. In fact, two over the space of 7 years, my same knee needed to be rebuilt twice. So I've got a knee that really is sort of just held together by screws and wires. So as a result, I had to sort of adjust what I do training wise as I get older. So it coincidentally meant that as I got older, I started training by lifting weights and doing, circuits, CrossFit circuits a lot more, rather than I can't go out and run 5K or 10K. I won't go and play tennis or football or anything like that because of the damage to the knee. But I am able to do little sprints in a gym, or I am able to jump up on boxes. I've done Spartan races and things like that. So I can do it. But what I've found is that the older I get, and I'm very passionate about this, the more committed I am to try and stay as physically strong as I can, and also to dispel some of the myths about aging. So, for example, they say that you're going to lose muscle. Well, I've put muscle on since I was probably 55. I'm 60 now. I do take on the challenges that everyone in the gym takes on, and every now and then there'll be something where I'm better. I do a better time than everyone, even the 20-year-olds in the gym. And it might just be, as my trainer says, that I'm a cussed old guy who won't give up, and who's, from a generation where you just eat the pain, and, you don't let it, put you off. But on a more serious note, I'm a huge believer that when you do what I do for a living, where it works on a number of levels, just the demands of doing a live show, I found that if I put in a good training session earlier in the day, as the night wore on and it got a bit tiring, I could channel the strength, the endorphins that I'd released earlier in the day, and I could reuse them to just energize me and keep me, very alive on screen. I found that in an industry where there's, our industry is quite a competitive one. There's a degree of politicking that goes on and what have you. I found that if I knew that I was in good physical shape, that I could take on challenges in the gym, then anything that might happen in the work environment, I could get through, no problem whatsoever. You spoke about, difficult flying here, doing this, working on that. If you get yourself in the best shape you can be, those challenges aren't as insurmountable. If you're not in great shape and you are flying and working long hours and not eating great because you're at work all the time, it's gonna come back to haunt you. So I'm really looking to be as active and as fit and healthy as I can for as long as I can, because that will prolong my career, it will prolong my productivity, it'll make me feel good about myself. And I try to speak on this and advocate for this as much as I possibly can. And that's an area I'm looking to do more in when I speak to companies and speak to individuals.
But with that kind of pain that you go through and the suffering, how do you keep that aside and still do the thing? How do you said you're good at compartmentalizing things a few moments ago.
Yeah.
It's tough. It is one thing just to get up and wear your shoes and go for a run. That itself is tough for many. And here you're suffering. And how do you reason with your brain saying that, all right, I still need to do this? How do you do that?
Well, you've just come up with a great segue there. You've brought up something I spoke about earlier on in the interview, the compartmentalization. That's a huge part of it. Pain can be compartmentalized. And that's something that I learned, and I've heard athletes speak about it as well. I'll tell you this, there's virtually not any, certainly let's take football, for example. There's virtually no footballer who plays any match injury-free. They always have something. There's always something. What you do is you just take that bit of pain, you compartmentalize, you put it aside. So yeah, I know it's there, but sorry, you can't be a factor today. I'm going to be able to function as best as I can. So I've always been able to do that. I always feel that it's a question of the balancing out the reward against the pain. So if by doing this workout, I'm going to get this benefit from it, I'm prepared to put up with a bit of pain. And putting up with pain for me is a hugely important part. Sometimes when you're doing a job, and you can't get, presenting sport on TV isn't exactly frontline soldiering. It's not exactly being a firefighter. Let's make no mistake about it. But there are times when it's tiring or a little bit uncomfortable or stressful, and you do get, as you said, crises coming in when things aren't going well. If you have managed to cope with a horrible, grinding, painful workout, you've built up such a resilience and such a mental strength that you say to yourself, if I got through that in the gym today, I can get through delivering this TV show. That'll be fine. And I think that's something that keeps me going.
Amazing. Anna Lemke, she was kind enough to join me on a podcast. She's the head of, addiction clinic at Stanford. And she said something similar, John. She said that, we are suffering today, not because we have too much pain, but apparently because we have too little of the right kind. And that we need to,
good line.
seek things that are hard and that give us meaning and purpose is what she was trying to get at, which you would agree with that then? Yeah.
100%. That's a great line, and that little bit of pain just focuses you, a bit like the nerves we started off talking about right at the start of this session.
Right.
You know, that anything that just gives you that little bit of an edge that separates you from an ordinary performance and an elevated one.
Great. John, on that note, thank you very much for your time. And where can we find you, John? You've got a new website going as well, if you can throw that in.
Yeah, I put a lot of the work I do, particularly in the corporate speaking space, through www.johndykes.co, which gives you some examples of what I do. I'm very active on LinkedIn, as you said. I do a combination of sort of, plugging the stuff I do and also just trying to reflect on things that I see happening, and it's not me just nitpicking about language. I promise you, I'll put something up there. I just wrote a piece today which was talking about the changing nature of consumption of sport, particularly football, and the move away from what I used to do, my stock in trade, which was analytical work around matches. So I'm very active on LinkedIn, and I do a little bit on social media on X or Twitter and on Instagram, but nothing too meaningful.
No, but I think I loved your LinkedIn posts. They are long. Unfortunately, people are now used to 280 characters, but it's fun to read those posts. Again, John, thank you very much.
I won't change. I won't
Sorry.
change. I'll carry on posting. And thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk for ages here. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you, John.